You don't need a luxury kitchen to prepare gourmet meals. My name is Dennis. I live in a mobile home in a trailer park, and this is my kitchen. Today, I want to return to the art of bread making. I watched an episode of a BBC series, Paul Hollywood's Bread. In this particular episode, he made ciabatta, and it looked challenging. It looked like it might be fun. And the very next day, I got an email from a fan of my YouTube channel, and she said, please teach us how to make ciabatta. So that sealed the deal. Now, ciabatta, according to Mr. Hollywood, is a new bread. He said it was invented by an Italian race car driver, even though it's reached icon status. It's an iconic bread. It's a very airy bread, big bubbles in it. I think the exact opposite of a bagel or a pan to me, which very, very tiny, small bubbles. It's a big, airy bread, and it looks like it might be fun to make. Now, how you start a ciabatta typically is you make a sponge the day before. There are other words for it, like poolish or biga. It's a very wet, it's a batter more than a dough, and you let that ferment at room temperature on the kitchen counter overnight, and that adds more flavor. And then the next day you work in more flour, more yeast, more water if needed, to actually put your dough together, and then you let that rise to start making the bread. So that's what I want to do this evening, is I want to make this sponge as kind of a pre-ferment for tomorrow's bread. So let's get cooking. In a large bowl, I'm going to be putting 3/4 of a pound, 340 grams of bread flour. When I bake like this, I always do things by weight, not by measurements, because there's too much variation. So that's 340 grams, 3/4 of a pound of bread flour, and then about half a teaspoon of active dry yeast. You don't need a lot right now, because what's going to happen by this fermenting overnight, the yeast is going to multiply in there. So you start off with very little yeast. I'm going to mix that together. No salt yet. That goes in tomorrow. And then this is 1.5 cups, 355 milliliters of water. And this is just at room temperature. This doesn't need to be warmed up. Normally you use warm water to activate the yeast, but we don't need to worry about that right now because there's so much time for the yeast to get active overnight. And then you just bring this together until it's mixed together. And you can see how wet of a mixture that is. That's more of a batter than a dough. Okay, that's it. That's my sponge. I'm going to cover that with plastic now and then just let it sit overnight. I'll check it later on before I go to bed, and if it's really rising up a lot, I have a larger container that I can switch it to if I need to. But I don't think this will rise up over the top, because what's going to happen is it'll rise up so much and then collapse on itself, and keep doing that throughout the night. Here we are now, the following day. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. I started this at around 8 o'clock yesterday evening, so this has been going for over 12 hours. And you can see how much that has risen. It's all bubbly. I've been watching it. Some of the bubbles are popping. It kind of looks like the top of a pancake. When you're cooking a pancake, and then it starts getting all bubbly when it's time to turn the pancake over. Now, one important thing about making a ciabatta dough is that the dough is so wet and moist and sticky that every recipe I saw said to use a stand mixer and not your hands to mix the dough. So I'm going to be transferring this sponge now to the bowl of my stand mixer, and then I'll be adding more flour, some more water, some more yeast, and then adding my salt. So I have my sponge here, and I'm going to transfer this to my mixer bowl. Look how wet that is. That's a wonderful mixture. And let me take this out of the way for a moment. I want you to see the stretch on that. See how that stretches nicely? It's got some tearing to it, but that's the gluten's already starting to build up. All right. That just pours into that bowl. No sweat. All right. I'm going to wash that bowl out, and I'll use it later when I'm ready for the dough to rise. Set this in my stand mixer, lock it in place, and then put in my dough hook. That's ready. What I have here is 1 1/4 pounds, 567 grams of bread flour, and then I have 1 1/2 cups of water, 2 teaspoons, you can go up to a tablespoon if you like your bread a little more salty, 2 teaspoons of salt that I'm going to dissolve right in my water. Might as well use this for that. That way I don't have to worry about dispersing it in the dough. It'll just go right in with the water. And then I have 3/4 of a teaspoon of active dry yeast. You could use instant yeast. It's not going to really matter. I'm going to start my mixer up, and then using a scoop, I'm going to scoop flour in and then add some water, put my yeast in with the flour when it first goes in, and then working back and forth between the flour and the water, I'm going to get all the water and the flour incorporated into my sponge such that I will have a very soft, wet bread dough. So raise my bowl, start this on number 2, put my yeast in there, some of the flour, and then some of the water. So this now has been kneading for an additional 10 minutes in the machine. Look at that. It's a lot smoother, beautifully elastic. That's what I want. You can see how sticky that is. And what I'm going to need to do, it'll make it a lot cleaner, is I'm going to put some oil on my hands. Because this is so sticky. And now transfer this to my oiled bowl. Even oiled, my hand has some dough stuck to it. I love the feel of this dough. It's got plenty of elasticity to it. It's a nice stretchiness. Look at that. That's beautiful. That's a nice dough. Now, I'm going to wipe my hands here as best I can. Pull off some paper towel. Okay. I have a piece of plastic wrap here. I'm going to cover this, and I'm going to let this sit now for at least 1 hour. I want this to have plenty of time to rise, and then I'll be ready to start shaping my loaves. I may go longer than an hour. I'd like to see that dough come up pretty much to the top of this bowl. My bread dough is nearly done rising. While I'm waiting, I thought it might be good to go over with you one trick that I use to try to improve, to increase the probability that the recipe will work. I've had a lot of experience with recipes that I've found in cookbooks, on the website, in magazines that somebody thought was a great idea, and they published it without ever testing it. And when you try to make the meal, make the food following their recipe, you fail. It just does not work. So what I do is I use a spreadsheet on my computer, but you can just write it on a piece of paper and create a table. And I look at a lot of different recipes. Like this has got 5 different recipes on it. And in this case, I'm looking at the ratio of flour to water. And I try to scale everything so it's the same. So if I have one recipe that says 1 pound of flour and 1.5 cups of water, and the other recipe says 2 pounds of flour and 3 cups of water, I scale that second one down so it says the same thing. And then I go to see what people are using. And most of the recipes here use about 1.5 cups of water per pound of flour. But some are way off. In one of my baking textbooks that I thought I could trust, he uses less than 3/4 cup of water to a pound of flour. I know that's not going to work. In fact, it's actually 1.5 cups of water for 2 pounds of flour. That's what he actually uses. Scaled down, it's way off. So by doing this and seeing what other people are doing, you can figure out which are the oddballs, the ones that are way off on the edges. Eliminate those, and chances are you'll end up with a recipe that will work. I need a flour mixture to rest my dough on as the loaves are doing their final rise. And then flour is going to also go on the top, and that'll help to give it a crustier crust. And what Paul Hollywood uses, and I like the idea, is he uses half durum wheat semolina and half regular flour. You don't have to measure this exactly. I'm just going to put a little bit in each bowl, a little bit of each in a bowl here. Like so. And then mix this up with a whisk. Durum wheat semolina is a harder flour. It's typically what you use when you make pasta, when you want that al dente, chewy texture in pasta. So I'm going to use this as a bed that my loaves are going to sit on, and then I'm going to sprinkle more over the top before I put them in the oven. I want you to see, first of all, my dough here. You can see this has come right up to the top of. I was hoping I wouldn't pull up any dough with it, but that's all right. Come up to the top of my bowl. And I'm going to start off by putting down a sheet of parchment paper and then oiling this sheet really well. I don't want this dough to stick. It is very sticky. Okay. And as it is, parchment paper has kind of a non-stick surface, but this dough is so sticky. And then, working as lightly as possible, I'm going to pour this over the top. And just ease that down onto the parchment. Doesn't matter if it doesn't all come out. I can grab some of this and pull it out. But this is very sticky. Okay. Now, even though my hands are a mess, that's okay. I want to wet. I'm getting more dough on this than I am oil. I want to cut into this and separate it as lightly as possible. Push it apart. Okay. There are my 2 loaves. All right. Next, I need to prepare another piece of parchment paper. I'm going to divide this parchment paper by cutting it right down the middle. And I'm going to set this aside. See, by having parchment paper like that, I can move the parchment paper without handling the dough too much. Get another piece of parchment paper down. And then on this, I want to sprinkle some of my flour mixture. If you can hear that, that's a train going by. And then wetting my hands here with oil. I want to shake this up a little bit. And then I want to turn this, I actually want to bring this up together a little bit. Just to pull this up into a little bit of a loaf shape. A better loaf shape than what I've got going already. Just going to pinch it together. Okay. Like so. And then I want to just turn this over gently right onto that flour. Even though that paper was oiled, I still got a little bit of sticking, but not bad. Okay, wipe my hands again, and then I want to sprinkle some of my flour mixture lightly on top. What this is going to do is it's going to give me more of a texture on the outer surface. After it bakes, I can brush a lot of this excess flour off. But it'll give me a nicer texture on the outside of the bread. I'm going to cut a little bit of this extra off because I don't need it. And then I'm going to slide this onto my baking sheet just by lifting the parchment paper and not having to handle the dough too much. Get that centered on there. And that's one sheet ready to go into the oven. I do have to let this rise some more. I'm going to wait another 35-40 minutes for this to do a little more rising. And then in the meantime, I'll be heating my oven up. Now I need to do my other piece. So, same thing. Piece of parchment paper down. Put down a bed of flour. What this flour on the bottom will also do is it'll help to protect it'll help to keep the dough from spreading out too much. I mean, it's very liquidy, so it's going to smear. Same thing here. Oil my hands. Get plenty of oil on my hands. And try to shape this into a bit of a loaf. I'm just pinching this up a little bit to give me more surface tension on the other side for a more rounded, smoother surface to the dough. But you don't want to do this too much, obviously. Again, we're trying to work this as little as possible. Now roll this over seam side down onto that flour. Lift it off very slowly and carefully so we don't tear the dough. Beautiful. Once again, rinse my hands. And then again, sprinkle flour mixture on the top. And I'm going to try, if I can, to nudge this in a little bit before I move that onto my baguette pan. See, it's going to overflow it a little bit. That has me concerned. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this up a little bit, just to gather those ends so it doesn't fall off the end. I'm going to cheat that in a little bit. Okay, so there's my baguette loaf. I have my other loaf on the other baking sheet. I'm going to let these sit for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then I'll be ready to bake them. In the meantime, I have heated my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 230 degrees Celsius. And I'm about to put my loaves into the oven. I'm going to bake them for a minimum of 30 minutes. Because I'm doing 2 loaves, I'm probably going to go a little bit longer, between 30 and 35 minutes. I want a nice golden loaf with a nice hard crust on the outside. I want you to see my 2 loaves of bread hot from the oven. That one's the flatter loaf. That didn't rise up a whole lot. It didn't rise up as much as I wanted it to, but that's okay because that's going to be for sandwiches. And see, this is a nice, thicker, rounder loaf. That's my baguette type. Now, there's a lot of that flour on the top. Once this is cooled down, I can really brush a lot of that off with a stiffer brush than this. Actually, I might as well do some of that now so you can see what I'm getting at. And underneath is a beautiful loaf of bread. Isn't that nice looking? Look at that. Now comes the hard part. You have to wait. You really have to let these cool down, because while they're still hot, the starches inside are still in a liquid form. And if you try to cut into it, that very tender crumb inside will just tear up. So you have to let them cool down so that those starches can solidify. My loaf now has had time to cool down thoroughly. So I want to cut into this and see what this looks like inside. Oh, listen to that. You can hear that crackly. Ah, see that? Nice bubbles. Bigger bubbles than I would normally get like in a French bread. That's what I want. That seems to me like a really good ciabatta. Okay, I've got to see what this tastes like. The texture is just, it's perfect. It's exactly what I wanted. Larger bubbles. Mmm. Oh yeah. A nice, tender, delicate crumb with a hard, crackly crust. What more could you hope for? Oh, that is so good. Now, I want to show you a sandwich that I want to make with that other piece of ciabatta. I want to make a sandwich for you that we used to have a lot in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, and we had places called grinder shops. And a grinder throughout other parts of the country is known as a hoagie, I believe, in New York, Other places call them subs or submarine sandwiches. You need sliced tomatoes. I have some iceberg lettuce here. And I cut this down the middle, right through the stem. And you want to shave this really closely and get really fine slices. If I'm going to be doing a lot of this, I have a rotary cutter that I can use for this. The finer, the better. And I don't mind a lot of lettuce on my sandwich. The more the better. When I was a kid, I used to just eat iceberg lettuce. If I was hungry, I'd go to the refrigerator, grab a few leaves of iceberg lettuce. I liked it because it tasted kind of sweet. Okay, put that aside. Gonna rinse my knife here and then clean up my mess, and I'll be ready to assemble my sandwich. All right, here's my flat piece of ciabatta. I guess I'll do it at this end. Nice crackly crust. Oh, that's nice. Lots of nice holes in there. That's important for this sandwich. I love the sound of that knife going through that bread. So the holes are important because they're going to hold the olive oil. This is extra virgin olive oil. All right. And then a couple of slices of salami. I'm using Cotto salami. Whatever salami you like, you can use. I grew up using Cotto salami on this sandwich. That's a slice of provolone. Put some tomatoes on there. I like these Roma tomatoes because I think they have a nice flavor to them. Some of my shredded lettuce. Beautiful. And then I want to put some freshly ground black pepper on there. Beautiful. A little sprinkling of salt. Not too much. And then more oil. And let the oil soak right down into that lettuce. That's why you want it finely shredded, because it'll hold more oil. Put the top on, press it down. Bring in a plate. Put the sandwich on the plate. Add some pickled peppers. You can slice those pickled peppers if you want and put them right on the sandwich. And that is ready to eat. That's what I would call a grinder. That's what we call grinders in New England. Okay, this is going to be a mouthful, and I know I'm not going to be able to talk while I'm eating this. So let me start off by saying, excuse me, but I'm going to go enjoy my dinner. But I do want to taste this because this is the first time I've made one of these grinders with homemade ciabatta. For a printable PDF copy of this recipe with step-by-step photographs, visit the White Trash Cooking website and look on the home page or in the recipe archive.